Hi, welcome to another lesson by me, Alexis Lundy. In today's lesson, we appreciate the great outdoors as we talk about the beauty right here in our backyards. We discuss how many artists have utilized their native wildlife as a source of inspiration for stunning artworks. Then we use that knowledge to create our own en plein air chalk pastel drawings. To begin, how well would you say you know your environment? Here in Texas, we have an abundance of beautiful native flora and fauna, and here are just a few. I'm going to give you a few seconds to study these and see if you can name any. Ready? Start. How'd you do? So here we have the Texas olive blossom, the Cali lophus flower, the Texas longleaf pine, Sika deer, and lastly, the desert cottontail. Hard to believe we have such diverse and interesting wildlife right here in Texas, but it's true. And many artists have strived to recreate these and many more in their artworks through a variety of methods. The method we're discussing today is that of en plein air, or in the open air. This is a method by painting or drawing where the artist attempts to capture the natural beauty of the outdoors by working right on site and creating the landscape or scene right in the moment. This method was made popular by French Impressionists like Claude Monet in the late 1800s and utilized broad, vague brushstrokes that focus mostly on how color and light reacts to the eye. The plein air artist we're going to be focusing on today is going to be that of Frank Ray, an artist whose service to Texas wildlife earned him the moniker of the Dean of Texas Painters. Ray sought to capture the Texas prairies, forest, and desert in its raw and uninhabited form, stating, he wanted it to be unsullied by smoke, and the broad, opalescent prairies not disfigured by wire fences or other signs of man. You can see some of his pastel works pictured here. Ray's favorite Texas native was that of the longhorn, a symbol here that I'm sure many of you Texans are very familiar with. He didn't forget the flora, however, and often painted many Texas wildflowers, like the ones found in the Panhandle, shown below. Let's take a closer look at one of Ray's works, titled Texas Cattle, to get a better idea of how he chose to portray the natural landscape. When looking closer at this piece, we can actually see that it is not nearly as detailed up close, where he uses color to help distinguish between forms, rather than lines or shapes. A good example of this can be in this tree here in the background. Notice how instead of seeing individual leaves, Ray instead layers the color in such a way that you instead get more of a general idea of which leaves are in the shadow versus the ones on top in the light. Speaking of color, Ray does an excellent job in observing the wide variety in colors, both on the cattle and of the light itself. Notice all the different layers of color in the atmosphere, which in turn can be seen reflected on the hides of the cows. And in the shadow, we can also see that Ray uses a variety of blues, purples, and pinks, with touches of browns to represent the light reflected off the cattle. Ray does an excellent job of capturing the atmosphere of the moment, and the serene and powerful beauty of the Texas longhorn. When making art, it is sometimes easy to forget that some of the best inspiration might be here around us. It's always good to take a second and try to focus on just the beauty of a moment, as Frank Ray did. And today we're going to do just that. For this project, all you're going to need is a pencil, some paper, chalk pastels, masking tape, spray fixative, and lastly, a clipboard. To begin, take your masking tape and tape along the edge of your paper and onto the clipboard like so. Where the tape is covering will later act as your margins, or border of your picture, so consider how wide you would want yours in the final product. Once that is done, time to find a location. For this piece, I have chosen the beautiful pecan tree as my focal point. Not only a Texas native, but also the state tree. This location has good lighting and a variety of shapes and spaces. Now that you have chosen your location, time to start with a few thumbnails. Now, a thumbnail is basically an idea sketch where you decide how objects will be laid out and proportioned on the page. Simply get a piece of sketch paper and draw a small general idea of what the final product should look like. As you can see, I'm using my thumb and forefinger to act as the corners of my page and as a point of reference when sketching. You are going to want 3 or 4 thumbnail sketches before you begin in order to make sure you have a strong sense of how things need to be laid out. Next, look at your thumbnail sketches and choose the best one to draw full scale on your tape piece of drawing paper. Once everything is laid out, time for pastels. Now, when working with pastels, the key is to not overwork your paper. So we're going to begin very lightly. First, I advise with blocking in the background. In art, the further back you go in space, the paler and more blurred things appear, which is called atmospheric perspective. So, for the sky, I'm going to just very lightly apply some blue chalk and blend downward with my finger by lightly rubbing. I'm going to continue to work my way forward in space, remembering to just slightly apply the chalk at first and blend with my fingers when necessary. The goal when blocking in shapes is to get the general lights and darks. Don't worry too much about the detail here. Once you have the entire image blocked in, it's time to add a little more color to certain areas to help better distinguish between shapes and to add some more depth to the overall image. It is also here that you should pay more attention to your pencil marks and consider how they can aid to the overall texture of certain areas. Notice how in the shadows, it is much cooler, so I incorporate some blues and purples to help really push that space against the warmer tones of the tree and of the light itself. Lastly, you're going to want to refine your image. And by this, I mean added the extra details, highlights, and textures that are really sure to help your image pop. Focus less on blending here and more on bold marks to help amp up the contrast and space. And here is the final drawing, though there are still a few more steps before we're complete. Take your image to a well-ventilated area and spray on your spray fixative. Keep the can at least 6 inches away from your image and make sure you cover it entirely to stop the chalk from smudging in the future. Once your fixative has had time to dry completely, very carefully peel off the masking tape around your final drawing, and voila! You've created a beautiful pastel drawing in plein air. Thank you so much for working with me today. I'll see you next time!